and happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm not going to say it in Irish. Why would I when I actually come from Manchester and was born in Manchester? However, like many of you, I'm part of the Irish diaspora, and both my parents were born in the Republic of Ireland, i.e. Dublin in my case. Now, to talk a bit about my Irishness and my sense of Irishness, I have been accused of being a plastic paddy, which is a weird one because I never really adopted the kind of Irish descent lifestyle. You know, when I grew up, I didn't go to Irish clubs per se, only a few times. I didn't kind of embrace a lot of the things that are associated with so-called plastic paddydom. However, I did always vaguely feel proud of being Irish. As for my parents, they were actually born in Ireland, as I said. My dad came over here just after World War II when he was aged 20, and yet his only expressions of his Irishness were drinking Guinness, going mainly to Irish pubs, betting mainly on horses with Irish names, not a good system by the way, and supporting any team at any sport whatsoever against England. In many respects, my dad hated the English, and he would every now and then refer a little bit to Irish history, and he'd tell us about Brian Boru and the Battle of Vinegar Hill. However, Brian Boru died in 1014 and the Battle of Vinegar Hill was in 1798, and I'm not sure that my dad didn't think that Brian Boru had fought at the Battle of Vinegar Hill. As for my mum, well, she was one of 8 kids. She moved over from Ireland to England, Manchester, back in 1932 when she was only aged 4. She was the 7th of 8 kids, and her youngest brother, my Uncle Bill, was actually born in Manchester and referred to by my Irish granny Bridget Cullen as the English bastard, even though he was her kid. Whatever he did wrong, it was because he was born in England. Now, in many ways, that is a bit twisted. So other than Catholicism, what was being Irish to us? What did it really mean? A fantastic book that came out, and I'm going to be talking about books for this St. Patrick's Day to all of you out there in the diaspora, and books about Irish history and about Irish identity. And maybe this could be the best one ever written. And it's Irish writer Fintan O'Toole, We Don't Know Ourselves. It came out just before Christmas, and it tells a fantastic story of Ireland and growing up in Ireland from 1958. What I really enjoy about it is a lot of the things that we associate with being Irish are mistakenly to do with being Catholic, when Ireland was there for thousands of years before there was any Christianity, before St. Patrick arrived, and certainly before the Catholic Church put its foot on the neck of the place. So this kind of identifying yourself as being Irish with Catholicism is a very strange thing. Now, there's a lot of that in there. What is quite amusing is he talks a lot about the Irish diaspora and well-known people in the Irish diaspora. And one of my favourite stories is about Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, when he was being interviewed in Ireland about his Irish ancestry, because he did have an Irish ancestor called O'Grady in America. This is about 1689, 1690, late 17th century. But he wasn't a slave owner, he was somebody who actually married an African woman. But because at the time Muhammad Ali was all about, you know, getting your kind of your African roots and your African identity, and he didn't want to be discussing this, you know, and moving the subject along. The best way he found to shut Irish journalists up back in the day, in the 1960s, was to go, well, I can't tell you much, but I know back in that time there was an awful lot of sneaking around went on at night, i.e. alluding to sex. And because of that weird Catholicism they had in Ireland, right away the subject is shut down and no longer discussed. In fact, for those of you who are Irish, and what is great in this book is it says the only time sex or anything controversial like that, misogyny and all the rest of it, the Catholic Church were ever discussed in a negative way in Ireland was always on Gay Byrne's Late Late Show or on his radio show on RTE, a favourite amongst all of the Irish diaspora in Great Britain at the time. I can remember my dad having, you know, medium wave on the radio and it whistling away, you could hardly hear it, listening to Gay Byrne on RTE. So anyway, that's a book that I would recommend. So basically what I want to do for this St. Patrick's Day is look at some of the great Irish history books that have really influenced and gripped me, and maybe, you know, recommend them to you. I'm not going to talk about novels, I'm just going to talk about these books that I read, and a lot of them they've made me view Irish history in a different way, because it's kind of underrated and underread. And we kind of, as part of the Irish diaspora, and our parents were the same, because we came from very poor backgrounds in the main, and we kind of grew up in a sort of culture of amnesia, if that makes any sense. That we, you know, as Fintan O'Toole says in the title of his book, we really don't know ourselves. And that's not just the Irish diaspora, that's many of the Irish in Ireland too. It's interesting, you know, we often talk about this idea of the United Ireland, and you know, history, the bit that gripped me was always, you know, the Romans and, you know, the Dark Ages. And in terms of Irish history, you always thought, well, when was there ever a United Ireland in history? And in fact, there never was, as it turns out. The closest it ever got was when Brian Boru became the High King of Ireland. Now, what's interesting in the story of Brian Boru, and I would really recommend this book if you can get hold of it, it's quite academic, written by Roger Chastity Newman from Southampton University. And Brian Boru became the High King of Ireland in 1002 and then died at the Battle of Clontarf against the Vikings in 1014. And in that time, in that kind of 12 years, there was a kind of United Ireland. Brian Boru was Brian Mac Kennedy, Brian the son of Kennedy, and he basically almost invented or imposed surnames on all the Irish so he could tax them. So Brian Boru literally means Brian of the tributes. And so he gave every, so he said, right, oh, you're an O'Brien, you're a this, you're a that, you're a Kelly, I will now tax you. I will now make you pay up. And so because everybody did, he came the closest thing to, if you like, a king of Ireland, a king of a United Ireland. And what he wanted to do was set up a dynasty. Now the weird thing is, until Brian Boru was the High King, there was an unbroken line for over 640 years of the High King of Ireland being part of the O'Neill clan in what is now Ulster. So unless you were an O'Neill or the O'Neill, you could not be the High King. How Brian Boru changed that was he kind of, once he captured Leinster off the Vikings and, you know, kind of pacified Dublin and Limerick and places like that, captured that off the Vikings, he then formed this massive army with 400 Viking longships that he could send up the Shannon, with a mixed army, if you like, of his own Dalcassians, his own kind of men, plus Vikings that he kind of brought on his side. And he said, no, the High King of Ireland isn't the O'Neill. The High King of Ireland is whoever's got the most powerful army. Now, unfortunately for Brian Boru, when he died at the Battle of Clontarf, his son died, Murray MacBrien, and even his grandson died. So he only had one grandson who actually survived the Battle of Clontarf. So he couldn't set up this dynasty that would maybe unite Ireland, you know, for all time, and so that it would be in a stronger position. Unfortunately, what happened for Irish history was Brian Boru, by breaking that law of the O'Neill is always the High King, instead it's the one with the most powerful army, that led to Dermot MacMurrough, the King of Leinster, about 150 years later, 1169 was it, something like that, fleeing when he was attacked by the then Irish High Kings to England, and kind of courting Henry II to kind of help him out and send him back with a mercenary army of Norman knights. And that's what happened, you know, and that's when Strongbow went over with Norman knights to support Dermot MacMurrough, and then he became a kind of King of Ireland by marrying Dermot MacMurrough's daughter, Aoife. And so that was it. In many ways, Brian Boru, perhaps the greatest Irish king ever, in fact, set the template for Ireland being conquered by the British. So that's definitely one that I would recommend if you can get hold of it. Another interesting one is when you look into Irish history is how militarised the Irish were, because obviously they were occupied by these various Norman barons who set up their own like little mini kingdoms within Ireland. So a lot of the Irish names nowadays are actually from the Norman French, whether it's Wogan, Coogan, de Burgh, which became Burke, Fitzgerald, Fitzpatrick, all the rest of them. And then you've got other Irish names like Gallagher, and in particular Sweeney, or Mac Sweeney, and they were Gallaglasses. And what they were like Hiberno-Norse, like a mixture of Irish and Viking, who came from the Orkneys and the Hebrides to fight in the various Geraldine wars and other wars between the various factions in Ireland. And why they were employed was they carried these huge swords, huge two-handed swords and two-handed axes that were great against armoured footmen. So if you were fighting against Normans with armour, you were quicker than them if you just carried a big sword and you could slice through them, through the armour. So they became very effective, and they were used in the various wars in Ireland for about 500 years, even at the time of the fighting Prince of Donegal, Reggie O'Donnell. Even his men, when he went to the court of Queen Elizabeth, he actually bore some of these Galaglass warriors with him, using similar armour and the same kind of outfit, the same weapons. In terms of old Irish history, there was always this kind of Gaelic mistiness, a bit like river dance in a way, about the sort of kings and the Vikings and all the rest of it. And this was actually a reading book in a lot of the schools in Ireland in the early part of the 20th century. This is William O'Byrne, Kings and Vikings. And whether you can get hold of this, I don't know, but it's got a lot of stories about the conflict with the Vikings in Ireland that went on for years and years. And then of course it's got loads about Brian Boru and how he rose from being like the 11th of 12 kids to become the High King of Ireland. Even for him to become King of Munster was unthinkable at one time, and how he fought the Vikings all his life until at one point I think he was down to only 15 men, according to the legends, fighting a guerrilla war against the Vikings of Limerick around the Burren of Clare, the Burren, that sort of weird rocky wasteland, and that's where his men were kind of hiding out. So that's a fantastic one to get hold of if you just want to get that kind of feeling and a lot of the poetry. I suppose it was kind of influenced by W.B. Yeats, who was all about Ireland going back to its Gaelic past. And you see a lot of that now in Ireland and amongst the Irish, especially amongst the middle classes, where they'll often give the kids, very Gaelic sounding names and make it even harder for school teachers over there to pronounce their pupils' names. Another one, which is by the same guy. If I can find it. Oh no, this was a similar era, is Alice Stopford Green, and this is one of the first great Irish history books, and it's the history of the Irish state till 1014. So again, it talks about Ireland and great kings like Cormac MacCart, Niall of the Nine Hostages. Niall of the Nine Hostages, he was the king apparently, or they reckon, when St. Patrick was actually kidnapped, and the Irish at that time virtually conquered half of Britain. So if you ever go, for a holiday break to North Wales, the Llyn Peninsula, Llyn was actually an Irish king. And then even down in the south of Wales, the Brecon Beacons, Brecon was an Irish under-king. And Niall of the Nine Hostages was actually killed in the Alps by one of his own men, shot with an arrow, in his back, while he was chasing the Romans out of Britain with treasure. So he was following them all the way into the Alps. Now, whether that's a true story or not, but it wouldn't be surprising. The world is a much smaller place than you think, and people are a lot more sophisticated back in that era than you would believe. Another great Irish history book I'd recommend. This is more modern Ireland. This is R.F. Foster, Modern Ireland 1600 to 1972. So a lot of this deals with the time, the Battle of Kinsale, the time when perhaps Ireland could have been free. They came within an inch of doing so, when the Spanish landed a big army. But the problem was, I think it was, the Irish at the time couldn't coordinate with the Spanish well enough, and so ended up being defeated by a much weaker English army. And at that time, Ireland could easily have been free, and then obviously it goes through all the Cromwell era, the plantation, but in a lot of detail. So again, it's one for the real history buffs out there. But I think, if you're into Irish history, it's kind of more interesting than British history in some respects, because there's so much struggle goes on, and there's such a way of remembering it, so a lot of the songs that they have in Ireland remember these events, because if you think a song in those days is a way of going against the fake news or keeping the spirits up. So, an awful lot of Irish rebel songs are from, 1798 and the Croppy Rebellion and, Robert Emmet and all around that time. If you think about Boulavogue, Kelly, the boy from Callan. In fact, Kelly was John Kelly, and he was supposed to be about 7 foot tall, and he was one of the leaders of the United Irishmen, and he actually got wounded in the Battle of Vinegar Hill, retreated to Wexford, where he was wounded. The British then captured Wexford, caught him, wounded, hung him, and then they decapitated him, chucked his body in the river, and then played football with his head. And then eventually, when they got fed up with that, stuck it on a spike in the city gates. Lovely little story, that one, isn't it? This is a nice one again. The Oxford Illustrated History of Ireland. So again, it's a good coffee table book, nicely illustrated. You can dip in and out of it. Again, it goes all the way to the kind of beginnings and pre-Christian Ireland, the Christianisation of Ireland. This is another reading book by William O'Byrne. This is actually given to a young kid at school in London from the Educational Borough of West Ham for good conduct and punctuality in 1907. And again, this is like stories of Ireland, A Land of Heroes by William O'Byrne. And again, this would have been very much influenced by W.B. Yeats. And if you're thinking, well, why would they give a kid in an English school a book about Irish heroes or Irish fairy tale, Irish sort of tales of the past? Well, of course, Ireland was part of Britain at the time. So it'd just be like, buying your kid Rob Roy by Walter Scott or something like that. Something a bit more political again was this, and it was made into a fantastic, I think it was a Channel 4 series in the early days of Channel 4. And it's the journalist Robert Key, Ireland, A History. And again, it was a brilliant documentary, and I think you'll still be able to find episodes of it on YouTube. And this was kind of the accompanying book. I'm not sure whether the book came first or the documentary, but they were both authored by Robert Key, who was a great journalist, and had actually fought for the British in World War II, and was taken prisoner by the Germans, and did write a fantastic book about his time as a prisoner of war called A Crowd Is Not Company. So that's another great book to watch out for by Robert Key. This I found really moving when I bought it many years ago, is Irish Hunger, Personal Reflections on the Legacy of the Famine. And so it dips into a lot of the eyewitness accounts of the time, but many of the people writing about it are well-known, Irish American and Irish authors, and their kind of thoughts on it and about how the Irish were perceived as well at the time, because a lot of the English were frightened of the Irish, because of their diet, although it was a bit kind of limited, of potatoes and buttermilk, they were actually healthier than the average Englishman at the time. And that's why in the Napoleonic era, and then even later during the Crimean War, something like half of the British army were actually made up of Irish soldiers. And the reason for that was when they changed the cartridges in the guns, they would have to bite the end off. And a lot of the English didn't have the teeth to bite the end off. So the Irish became a kind of cannon fodder because they had teeth. Better dentistry, I don't know. But the Irish Hunger is a horrific book. Because the more you think about it, you think about 1 million people dying of starvation and related diseases. But it's not so much 1 million people that died of related diseases and hunger and all the rest, and then another 1.5 million, kind of had to migrate either to England, the USA, Australia. Lots of them died. Maybe as many as 200,000 or 300,000. One of the most horrific stories at the time of the famine was a number of Irish that were landed in New Orleans and that area and would work for as little as 5 cents a day. So the local landowners who wanted to drain areas of swampland, rather than send their slaves in, sent the Irish in, because the mosquitoes and the yellow fever and all the other stuff was so bad in the swamps that they didn't want it killing their slaves who were part of their property. But the Irish, you could just go to the docks and get another one straight off the boat. So they literally died like flies there. Another horrifying thing, and a new fact that's come out about the Irish during the potato famine, is they reckon that the number of 1 million of them dying is vastly underestimated, because in the 1841 census, so much of Ireland was completely inaccessible. And they reckon that the population was estimated at being 8.5 million. They reckon it was more like 10 million. And then, of course, with the next census, 1851, they noticed that there was 2.5 million less people in Ireland. But they reckon it could be 3.5 million less. So again, a really good book, Irish Hunger, Personal Reflections on the Legacy of the Famine. One for the Irish diaspora, which I really loved, is a great Irish writer as well. He's written fantastic biographies of Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, as well as the kind of, maybe it's his opus dei, is The Troubles, and that's Tim Pat Coogan, and the book is Wherever the Green is Worn. Now, this book is all about the Irish diaspora, and absolutely fascinating, because it kind of talks about the Irish going all the way back before the English. So even at the time of the Emperor Charlemagne, when he was the Holy Roman Emperor, of the Franks, but he also owned big chunks of what is now Germany, northern Italy, even northern Spain at one time. And Charlemagne was illiterate, and so were most of his people. So all his civil servants were all Irish monks. And the first examples of a treaty, a modern day treaty, was between the Franks and the Saxons. And it's the first example of German being written and what would then become French being written. There's about one paragraph of the treaty written in French, about a page of it written in German. The rest of it is all written in Irish. So again, some fascinating stuff, about how, the Irishmen who founded the Argentinian Navy, the Chilean Army, the Irish involved as mercenaries after the American Civil War. A lot of the Irish who'd fought for both the Confederacy and for the Union between 1861 and 1865 were then enticed to Brazil to help overthrow the Portuguese. So the Brazilian War of Independence. And they were invited there and said, right, we'll pay you X amount of money, come down, fight for us, overthrow the Portuguese, we'll sort you out. Now, by the time that war had finished, they didn't have enough money to pay the Irish. So they put them all in prison, all these Irish mercenaries. And then they finally said to them, look, we can't afford to pay you, but there's a revolution going on in Bolivia. If you go and fight for them, we'll double your money. And they said, okay. And so they were involved again in helping Bolivia, become like free in another revolution. So the Irish, this book, I would just recommend it so much, Wherever the Green is Worn. And again, it's one that you can dip in and out of. It's got great stories about Australia and the convict years in Australia between 1788, from 1788 to like 1888, when they carried on sending all the convicts over. What's interesting is how many of the convicts were Irish, and how the whole tone of the Australian, how can I put it, society and culture changed because of the Irish. Because up until the Irish started being sent out in big numbers to Australia, in particular after the 1798 rebellion, when a lot of the rebels from that were transported to Australia for life. Before then, all the songs were about, whatever you do, boys, don't be a poacher, don't get sent to Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania, as a convict, life here is hell. As soon as the Irish went over, suddenly the songs became quite defiant. And there were even like examples of where you'd see the punishment books in the old colonies, where someone would get 60 lashes for singing a song. And the only rebellion amongst convicts in Australia, in its history, was the Irish convicts, who had like a mini rebellion over there. And even the battle that they were defeated at became known as the Battle of Vinegar Hill Part 2. So fantastic book, Tim Pat Coogan, Wherever the Green is Worn, really highly recommended. This is one of these more modern ones, Dermot Ferriter, and this is called The Border. And again, it's one of those things about the history of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and especially, Brexit and the protocol and all the rest of it. This will be of interest to those of you. This is kind of one of the most modern books that I'm talking about today, along with the Fintan O'Toole, We Don't Know Ourselves. This is a book that everyone of Irish descent should have. It is amazing. It's almost like a blow-by-blow account and diary with eyewitness accounts of Agony at Easter, written by Thomas M. Coffey. I think it originally came out in around 1969-1970. This particular copy is from 1972. Costs a bit. It's all about the 1916 Easter Rising. Fascinating, fascinating little snippets about the characters involved in it. James Connolly, the Irish Workers' Party, who made up about 270 odd of the 700 people who were involved in the Easter Rising, were actually members of James Connolly's Workers' Party. And yet on the other hand, you have these very kind of Catholic and conservative poet types. It's basically the workers, the socialists and the poets who took part. So Patrick Pearse, Joseph Plunkett, and various others. Even a character called O'Rahilly. And O'Rahilly was against and told people not to turn up on the day, because he said it was a suicide mission. And he was kind of a real kind of Irishman, yet spoke with a posh English accent. And he turned up in a motor car on the day of the Rising and joined in and turned up, even though he was, kind of quite an enemy of Patrick Pearse and thought these guys were stupid. But he said, well, if you're going to sacrifice yourself for Ireland, I can't miss out on it. So he had to be there. Another thing that I found quite amusing in it was the fact that there were two Swedish sailors who turned up and said, oh, we don't like the English either, so we'll come and fight for you. And they kind of volunteered in the post office, on this kind of suicide mission. So again, Agony at Easter, the 1916 uprising, very recommended if you can get hold of a copy. You might have to pay a little bit through the nose and get it on eBay. For a bit of comical writing, I thought this one, Joseph O'Connor, has written some fantastic novels, but The Secret World of the Irish Mail is very funny. And it's weird to think, and maybe it's the Dublin connection. And I think about my dad and the kind of things he said and his attitude to life. And there's so much of it in this, The Secret World of the Irish Mail. And just talking about being Irish, and it's that, I don't know, I think it was Sigmund Freud, the psychologist, said that the Irish are impossible to psychoanalyse because they're so given to fantasy. Yes. So that's it, The Secret World of the Irish Mail. Oh, and apparently his sister is Sinead O'Connor. He obviously couldn't sing. This is another very funny Liam Fay, beyond belief. And he was right. He used to write for Hot Press and various other people. But this is absolutely hilarious. I'm not even going to say anything else about it. Obviously, the Irish character, obviously the Catholic Church gets a bit of bashing, but then so does everyone else. This is just brilliant. I don't even know if you can still get hold of it, but it is a laugh out loud book. On a slightly more serious note, this is something that you can now buy on DVD. It was kind of remastered in 2004 from the original documentary made in 1968, The Rocky Road to Dublin. And it's basically an Irish-born journalist called Peter Lennon and this French director who kind of collaborated on this documentary, which basically slags Ireland off in a very subtle way and says this is a problem with Ireland. And of course, what is that problem? The Catholic Church. Sorry. Hey, I'm a recovering Catholic myself. What can I say? The one thing I can say about Catholicism, for all those of you like me, are part of the Irish diaspora, how does it make you feel about your life? Well, for me, it's like no matter how beautiful the spot is where you lay out your picnic blanket, there's always a dog turd on the grass next to it. And finally, I'm going to do this one. This is Brendan Behan, After the Wake. This is very short stories that Brendan Behan, one of the greatest Irish writers, wrote. And I love his books, Borstal Boy, his autobiographical. Then, of course, Confessions of an Irish Rebel, which is his tour de force, I think. And some great stories. And that's what Brendan Behan was. He was a storyteller, but all about truth and his attitude and his confrontation and his interpretation of the truth. And just brilliant. Really gives it up the begrudgers and the hypocrites. That's what I love about Brendan Behan. And then finally, look at this. Sent to Private J. Barry in World War I, after World War I in 1918. He'd been wounded and taken prisoner by the Germans. And this is King George. Now this is a guy, Irish born, from Munster. And, just so many Irish fought in World War One, including my granddad, Lawrence Cullen. Not only did he fight in World War One, he joined the Connaught Rangers in 1904, fought through the whole 4 years of World War One, from 1914 to 1918, was actually wounded twice, gassed, and then taken prisoner by the Germans, gassed very badly in March 1918, and then finally repatriated back to, Britain, if you like, in December 1918, about a month after the war had finished, and he never worked again because his lungs were that shot. And after 14 years in the British Army and 4 years on the Western Front and even a stint in India on the Northwest Frontier, what was his reward? Oh, he made it all the way, just like this guy did, to private. Can't be anything to do with him being Irish there, can it? Now, I've spoken about some Irish books today. This is just a bit of a tryout. This is for those of you who are geeky like me and want to know a little bit more about your Irish heritage, your Irish history. I will never be able to learn the Irish language. I've left it too long. In many ways, that's a tragedy in itself, because let's face it, was the Irish language was the way that the Irish themselves interpreted their own lives and their own island for thousands of years. And that was basically really stamped out during the potato famine, because they reckon up until the potato famine, something like 2/3 of the Irish only spoke Irish, and many of them, a big proportion of them only spoke Irish, didn't speak any English. But then not speaking English became synonymous with starving to death. Look, I hope you've enjoyed it. This is the Culture Bunker. Click subscribe if you want. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, and we'll talk a bit more about our Irish heritage.